Hello everyone and welcome to our INSET for this half term. It's your choice as to when you do the INSET. We're setting two forms with various videos attached, various different tasks attached. The first form that we look at is set up to talk about equity in teaching, and as well as this presentation from myself and Sam Fania, there are also three other presentations for you to watch, very short ones. So Carolyn Sims-Evans is presenting, and so is Olivia Basterto, and the other person who's presenting is Ross Robinson. So we've got three issues affecting teaching and learning, all linked to the same area, which is about literacy and reading. As I said, it's your choice as to when you decide to do this INSET. If you're choosing to do it on Friday, then that's absolutely fine. If you're choosing to do it in your evenings, choosing to do it over half term, that's fine. The deadline to complete this particular set of INSET opportunities is, please, by the 8th of March, which is obviously the date that the government has set as the earliest return to school, because we intend to release other material around about that time as well. As I said, there's two forms for you to work with. So this is the first of the two forms. The second form is a form that has got multiple different sessions involved in it, and you choose how many of those sessions you do. So you can either do one session, or if you wish to do all 5 of the sessions, that's absolutely fine as well. I'll talk you a little bit through that process later on. This particular part of the session, this is the longest of the videos in session 1. It's going to be about half an hour in length. So please bear with me. By all means, if you need to pause the video at any stage, feel free to do that. Have a quick look around. Megs Wilburn has spoken to many of the heads of faculty about the 20-20-20 rule, which is this idea that if you do 20 minutes online, you should have 20 minutes offline, and you should try and focus on an object that's 20 meters away. So 20-20-20. This idea of changing your vision rather than looking something that's up close all the time. So this first session then, equity in teaching. Now, equity in teaching is something that I presented to you right at the beginning of the year, and is this idea that we are trying to close those gaps, trying to stop the big gaps that have appeared. So it might be gaps within genders in your classrooms. It may have been specific gaps between different abilities of youngsters. It may be the gaps that are appearing between pupil premium youngsters and those who are not on the pupil premium list. And I know that each of the faculties and each of the different department areas, you're going to have different priorities when it comes to thinking about equity in teaching. We started at the beginning of the year in September, and we started by talking about our teaching program for this year, which was called Map, Master and Move Forwards. And that very much still continues. And regardless of whether we're in a lockdown or we're under the measures that we've got at the moment, this is still a good program for the year. The idea that we are constantly thinking about where we're at compared to where we need to go. We're signposting that journey for the youngsters, and we're thinking about moving forwards. Once we've identified the different areas that we need to go to in order to complete our curriculum, we're then going to master, we're going to make sure that we're understanding the materials. We're using lots and lots of review material and various different methods to review the understanding of the youngsters, and then we're moving forwards again, and we keep going through the same cycle: map, master and move forwards, the whole time checking, seeing where we're at, signposting to the youngsters where they're at and how they're performing. So that's still in process for the year, and I would encourage you once again to go and have a look at that program. There's a link here at the moment, as you can see on the slide, and the slides are available with this particular assignment that's been set through the Google Classroom. Right at the beginning of September, I said this particular program, it was about this idea of equity. So in front of you at the moment, we've got a picture now. So I mean, my background is PE, so I'm going to keep coming back to that. But here's an image in front of you. Now, this image has got lots of things happening in it. So I can see the players on the pitch. I can see that they're chasing a ball. That's perhaps our exam curriculum. That's what we're working towards. But actually, there's other information out there as well. It's what we might refer to as the hinterland. It's all the other stuff that builds up. So there might be information on what the current form is on this team, what the weather's like, what the referee's like on the pitch. Lots and lots of other information that I might want my youngsters to know. And teaching the hinterland is really, really important. I'll tell you now, I was very, very concerned when I have heard schools choosing to narrow their curriculums and cut down the curriculums and just test specific things, hoping that they might come up in end of year exams or whatever assessments the government decide that they're going to put into place and the DfE decide that they're going to put into place. That really worries me, because when I came into teaching, I'm thinking about that whole subject area. How can I prepare my students for the next level? So we've got this picture in front of us, and here we've got our learners, and our learners have barriers in front of them. And for some of our learners, those barriers are far more difficult to overcome than others. So it may be that we're very privileged with the youngsters that we've got here. We've got lots of youngsters who literally, if you give them the material, they're like sponges. They pick up material, they learn from that material, and they can see the picture. They can still see over the barrier. For a lot of our youngsters, we've got to find a way of creating that learning environment that gives them the opportunity to look over that barrier. We might refer to that as equality in teaching. So it may be that I give them this knowledge, I give them this base. I'm a really good teacher, as are you. I mean, great teaching that goes on at the moment. We're seeing that at this moment in time as we're delivering online. There's some fantastic stuff going on, and our youngsters and our parents and everyone that is involved with the school and sees the school are very, very complimentary about what's going on, and you deserve to get a pat on the back at the moment. There's some fantastic stuff going on. But as I look at this idea of equality, I can see that I've still got learners here that are struggling. They're just seeing the picture. Maybe they're missing the hinterland. Maybe they're missing the extra stuff. They've just got this vision. It's like looking through a wall and just getting a tiny part of the entire learning experience. We also know that we've got a situation in place whereby youngsters are going to be affected. And it may be that home life gets in the way, and there may be things going on socially that cause the barrier to get bigger. In fact, the barrier is not getting any bigger. It's just that there's a hole being dug underneath that learning that we've put in place. That learning's not secure. So actually, what we end up with is a real life situation where we've got loads and loads of youngsters making fantastic progress, brilliant progress. We've got some youngsters making expected progress, and we've got this group here on the end who really the progress is being hindered in some way. And that's the group that we need to address. Perhaps this group, perhaps some of that problem is an issue that youngster's caused for themselves. Perhaps it's an issue that's to do with social life. Perhaps it's an issue to do with home life or circumstance that they find themselves in. And again, we'll keep referring to the fact that in this current time of online learning, not all the youngsters are going to be able to do all the tasks. They can't all do the practical tasks. They can't all do the online tasks. Some of them are using phones to see what's going on. Others have got lovely Apple Mac computers, the latest tablet, XYZ, and they've got that environment where they've got someone alongside them that's encouraging them. Realistically, this is what we're wanting to produce. We're wanting to produce equity in our teaching. We're wanting to produce an area where we can scaffold the learning, where we can differentiate the learning in order to enable our youngsters to all see the whole picture. And it's equity in teaching that we're focusing on now at this time in the year. We're thinking now about how do we get those youngsters up. I know all the departments have had various different focuses and you've been looking at different groups, but we've got an issue coming your way that is quite a big issue in terms of the situation that we find ourselves in at this moment in time. And the issue really is to do with literacy. So I'm going to hand over now to Sam, and Sam's going to present for a few minutes now on the access reading tests.
You may be aware that students across the school have been taking some reading tests recently in their English lessons, and this is under Hodder Education scheme called Access Reading Tests. This presentation is going to give a little bit of information about what data we managed to acquire and how you might want to use that data in your subject. So first, what's the basic information? Well, most students have been tested in years 7 to 11. Some were absent and there were some technical difficulties, but we're working to catch up those students who haven't yet taken the test. What was tested? Broadly speaking, reading, but there were 4 question types: analysis, literal comprehension, inference, and vocabulary. I'll give a little bit of information about how you might want to adapt your teaching based on how students have done in these particular areas. So what data is available to us? Well, the place you really want to go is on the shared drive under Staff Resources, English, and then Access Reading Tests. There you'll find PDFs for every tutor group, and most of the students will be on those PDFs, but we'll be refreshing those as we get more students caught up. And the things you'll really want to look out for are the reading age column, 3 columns in, and that breakdown of how they've done in particular question types. You can see that the students done remarkably well, but I'm going to explain a little bit more about why you might want to look at the reading age in particular and how you might address or adapt your pedagogy based on how they've done in those 4 areas at the end. There'll also be an opportunity for gap analysis based on your particular class, and we're working on getting that available in that folder as well. And on Sims, under your subject mark sheets, you will have just the reading age of each pupil as it was when they took this test a few weeks ago. So there are a couple of limitations to address, which is that the students' attainment on that day is accurately reflected, but that's not necessarily an indication of the overall picture of their attainment. They might have been feeling ill, and there might have been technical difficulties, and so that's got to be factored in as you look at this data. What is a reading age? Well, this is what you're going to have on Sims that will be readily available, and it shows the average chronological age of the pupils who obtained each particular raw score. So the age at which this level of performance is typical. But if you want to look at a more specific indicator of ability, the standardized test score is worth a look, and this graph on the right will explain how their score in the test fits into the overall picture of students nationally. How can we use this data then? So I'm going to go through each of the 4 areas. And the first one is analysis. I'm not going to talk about everything that I've suggested on the slide. You can pause it and have a look at that yourself. But I'm going to pick out 1 or 2 things on each slide. The first one is this, and it applies to English, to maths, to science, to every subject across the school. And it's where there's, in questions, the language that's used implies that a certain method needs to be applied to that question. And I think particularly in maths and science, some students, there's a barrier there in terms of understanding the language in the question, and so they're not sure what methods to apply to that question. And I think what might be really useful is if teachers explicitly explain and students have an understanding, perhaps by some kind of key or accessible worksheet, that explains what language is being used and what methods you apply when that language is being used in a question. Second one is literal comprehension, and one of the things that's really, really useful when you're looking at longer texts is to have what's called a cold read first, where there are opportunities to pause and reflect on meaning, but you're not analysing in depth. And what that enables students to do is to get a foothold in the text and to understand the basics before applying kind of more complex methods of analysis to that text. In terms of inference, one thing that's really useful is using videos and images to segue into textual inference. So students I've found often find it much easier to look at images to see a visual and to infer from that before they then think about applying that same skill to texts. And it might be a kind of a dual coding kind of deal where you have images that relate to the specific inference you want the students to make, or it might be a sort of prior starter activity beforehand. And finally, vocabulary, there are a few things there, but one thing that might be particularly useful is repetition.
So thank you for that, Sam. So I just wanted to show you where we might find these results on the system, because Sam refers to in his videos at that moment in time that we had the results in, they were stored in the English files, which actually staff don't have access to. So we've had them moved. So if I just show you how to access the individual pieces of information other than what you've got on Sims already. So in school, you're just going to simply click on your folder, your file folder here. If you're outside of school, you are going to use CC4. It's one of the few times that we might use CC4 outside of school. So I want to see those results, so I need to see a folder that's kept in school. So I click on my File Explorer box, and I'm going to be looking for, down in here, I'm looking for staff shared drive. So it's this one here, and it's also in red on the screen now. So I click on staff shared drive, and when the staff shared drive opens, I've got lots and lots of different options here. Now, at this moment in time, the folder is called English Reading Tests. English Reading Tests. Now, actually, I think the danger of it being called English Reading Tests, everyone thinks, oh, it's just to do with English. It's not at all. It may be by the time that you come to have a look for this, it's called Access Reading Tests. So please be aware of that. So you're looking for a file that's called either English Reading Tests or Access Reading Tests. It's on the first level. Double click on it and you get to the Autumn 2020 folder. Double click on that, and at the moment the only files that we actually have is in tutor group reports. So if I click on the tutor group reports, we've got all of the reports based by tutor group at this moment in time. So you can see there's lots and lots of PDF files. If I choose a particular tutor group, what I'm going to see is I'm going to see this form here, and it tells me the name of the student, their date of their test, their age at test, their reading age, the raw score, which probably we don't need to be too worried about the raw score part at the moment. But if we start to look over at these other columns here, we've got literal comprehension out of 20, inference out of 16, and general vocabulary out of 15. And you can start to draw conclusions based on these scores. So, and the vocabulary, look, we've got this particular student who's only got a score of 6, which is actually towards the very lower end in terms of their ability to cope with vocabulary. And the literal comprehension here, we've got another student here who's got a mark of 8 out of 20. So the literal comprehension, being able to understand what's been said, is a fairly interesting score to look at there. In terms of the inference that Sam talked to that was jumping off the page, this particular student, look, has got a score of 4 out of 16. So for being able to determine what the question is asking, this student's going to find that very, very difficult. So it is worth looking at individual tutor group scores. Now, the other place that we are going to find results is within Sims as well. So again, you may choose to use CC4 to go into Sims. So here's my Sims page at the moment that I'm sharing with you. What I would do is I would go Focus, My Mark Sheet, and here's all my mark sheets available. I'm going to choose my Year 9 PE class.
As I go into my year 9 PE class, you'll now see that you've got the names of the students and you've got their reading age here, look. So this would help you as a teacher, particularly when you're using pieces of text. If those pieces of text have got high levels of tier 2 language and tier 3 language, we're going to have to be really, really careful. But if we just take a look at the range that we have within this class at the moment, I'm not going to focus on the names, but let's just have a look at the range. We've got 18.6 years, so 18 years and 6 months at the top end of the class, and I've got a 6 years and 10 months reading age in the class as well. Now that has profound consequences for how I deal with literacy as a teacher, how I present written work, how I put things up on the board, and it means that I as a teacher need to model an awful lot of the language that's used. And again, if I'm using tier 3 language and tier 2 language, I've got to be really, really careful, and I've got to explain what that tier 2 language and what that tier 3 language means and use it in context as much as possible.
So there's the big issue then. The access reading tests show us that we've got a range of different abilities within our classrooms, a range of different reading ages. Now that has big consequences for the way in which we deliver work. At the moment, we're delivering virtually. So we've got to be really, really careful in the way in which we get that work over to the youngsters. There's lots of suggestions that Sam has made there about the way in which we read, the idea of which we use the cold read first before we then start to look at more analysis within the reading, the way in which text is presented. Olivia's session later on focuses on the SEN pupils, those who might have dyslexic tendencies or dyspraxic tendencies. We've got youngsters who have very specific learning needs as well. But you're going to be surprised when you look at the reading test results and when you look at your Sims mark sheets, you might find youngsters in there with a very low reading age who actually we have not yet identified as having a specific need until we've done these tests. When you start to look at your textbooks for your subjects and you start to look at the language that's used within the textbook, the level 2 or the tier 2 language and the tier 3 language that's used, so the language that's just specific to our subject areas, or the types of language that might be used within exam questions that just aren't used regularly within our youngsters' vocabulary. And we're going to have to explain them and really get down and drill down into ensuring that they understand what that type of language means. So Daniel Willingham, author of this book here, Why Students Don't Like School and Raising Kids Who Read and the Cognitive Mind, as 3 of his particular pieces of work. Daniel Willingham looks specifically at how the brain works and how youngsters learn through education. And there's lots of work that's presented from Daniel Willingham, but in the reading mind, Daniel Willingham talks about the different areas of the brain that are used. This beautiful, beautiful piece of note-taking and drawing has been presented by Grace Hudson from the Trinity Academy, and I've put her Twitter handle there at the bottom. But she says that Daniel Willingham highlights 6 different areas that we could work on with these youngsters, who are having specific issues with reading in the class. And you're going to find that when Olivia presents to you, when Carolyn presents to you, and when Ross presents to you, they're going to be talking about some of these factors as well, facts that they use in their classrooms at this moment in time. So this idea of changing your font up, using a type of font which is legible to someone with dyslexia. So we're looking at like Comic Sans as a type of font that could be readable for someone who's got dyslexia. Arial, I think, is another one that's recommended. There are specific fonts that you can use as well. Try to avoid asking the youngsters to read from the board. I have to say, with some of the lessons that I've seen, both in school and physical school and both online, sometimes we're packing so much onto the slides and there's so much text that's going to be very, very difficult to read. The background filter that we use is really, really important. Try and avoid black text on a white background. Try and use a pastel filter or something like that in the background that's really going to enable those youngsters to see those words very, very carefully. You've got the cold read, the comprehension type of question before we start going into analysis. Vocabulary banks is something that Carolyn's going to talk to you about when she's talking about guided reading within the classroom. Really doesn't matter what subject we're in the school, we all have to use reading. And I know one of the big aspects now that QCA are looking at and various different quality assurance bodies are looking at the moment is how we as a school develop this love of reading, this love of literacy. And again, it's not down to English as a subject, it's down to each of our different subject areas. Helen Demetriou is another author and psychologist working in education, and she's written this particular book called Empathy, Emotion and Education. And Helen Demetriou talks about 4 different strands that we can use within reading. And I know Carolyn focuses on this in her short presentation on how we can use guided reading in the classroom. So Carolyn looks at it from a humanities point of view, from a history point of view, from an RE point of view, from a geography point of view, and how we can start to pull out the key features and encourage youngsters not just to read the text once, but to read it multiple times before we start to look at the different layers, select different pieces of information that's coming out, and then start to zone that text. Think about what's relevant in the learning of that text and modeling it on a regular basis. I really think it's been great to see English using the multicolored highlighters in their anthologies that they've been working through. I see the same thing in RE. I see the same thing in history as well. The use of highlighter pens to really drill into that text is really, really important. It's something that we can learn cross-curricular from in the school. Hollis Scarborough, who developed this idea of the reading rope, talks about the fact that literacy is on 2 scales. We have a language comprehension that we work upon, and we've got word recognition that we focus on. Now, this is really, really important, particularly when we're working with youngsters who have specific learning aids. So if we talk about word recognition first, we use tiered language an awful lot in our subjects. Now, Ross does the presentation in a few moments' time on tiered language and recognizing what those key words are that are not in the everyday vocabulary of our youngsters is really, really important. I sat just last week, I was sitting on H3 as a classroom, and I had a number of students in there that were sitting at the BTEC course, and they were really struggling, not necessarily on the topic that was being set for in this particular test, but they were struggling with the language that was being used by the exam board, the language in the question. So, for example, this particular question used the word succinct in it. And I said, oh, do you know what that word means? And the student had no idea what the word succinct means. It's not something that was necessarily specific to PE, but it was a tier 2 type word. It was something that isn't in everyday use necessarily, wasn't part of that child's vocabulary, and it needed explaining to him. If I talk about a tier 3 type word, it may be something like the word fatigue. But fatigue for an awful lot of youngsters is read as fatigue. What's fatigue? What's that when it's at home? So this idea of creating language, developing language so that youngsters can use it and can recognize it is really, really important. And as I've said, the reading rope by Holly Scarborough is a great read. And you'll see here again in this particular slide, I've actually embedded a link. So if you choose to go back into this at a later time, you can see the research that Holly Scarborough has produced. And I know Holly Scarborough in particular has worked a lot with the Dyslexic Association and has produced lots of work on that. So lots and lots of things to take away from this particular piece of research. One of my favourite authors at the moment and an educationalist at the moment is this guy here that you see on the screen in front of you now. And he's done all sorts of stuff at this moment in time. The Learning Rainforest, the Walk Through Us. There's a second Walk Through Us coming through. Rosenshine's Principles in Action. Tom Sherrington, known as Teacherhead on Twitter, has spent a lot of time producing various different teacher development tools that we can use. And his latest one that he's worked on and been presenting on is the In Action series. So section 2, or the second part of the INSET, is for you to access these In Action series presentations. And there are 5 of them that we're going to be looking at. But the reason that I'm talking about this now is I've actually also got a document that was released 2 weeks ago by Tom, as he's talking about how we can apply Rosenshine's principles to youngsters in specific situations. So youngsters who are studying the arts, youngsters who are in early years education, youngsters who have SEND, how we can develop that through remote learning, how we can develop that in the classroom as well. And that's been shared alongside this particular presentation and this particular session now. So what do we need to do from here? Well, we stop and we take a break. 20-20-20 principle. You've now been looking at this screen for probably 28, 29 minutes. So we need to take that break, focus on something that's in the distance, not just looking at this half meter, 30 centimeter gap that you've got between the screen. Look somewhere else. Go and pause the video, get yourself a drink, step away from it. Go and do something for a few minutes. That would be my first piece of advice. We've then got 3 other parts to this compulsory training, 3 other sessions that have been worked on by the coach team. So as I've said, you've got a video on tiered language. What is tiered language? Understanding what tiered language is and how we can develop our use of tiered language, or develop the youngsters' knowledge of recognizing tiered language and what it means in the classroom by Ross. We've got a session on guided reading by Carolyn. And then we've got a 3rd session on barriers to learning by Olivia. So it's really important that you watch through those and then you reflect upon the types of practices that you're being shown in the classroom. Reflect as to whether you're using them, what you can pick up on them. At some stage over the next 2 to 3 weeks, when we get back into school, then have that opportunity to talk about it as a faculty team, as a departmental team. Talk about it with the other staff that you might see when you're in school, but start to share ideas on what we can do and how we can start to move that forwards, recognizing that we've got a very short time now for those year 11s and year 13s, thinking about how we move forwards with the other year groups. The second section to the INSET, as I said, is a section that's based on research masterclasses. So really developing our own individual skills on the latest research out there, and then how that can be applied in the classroom. Now, the second section is that you can do all 5 sessions that are on the sheet for you. You can work through, by all means, do that. But if you're just choosing to do one of them, that's absolutely fine as well. These are all here. They're accessible to you. You can access them over the next few weeks. Each of the sessions are approximately an hour long, except Rosenshine's Principles, which has actually got 2 videos to it. So it's approximately 2 hours in length. Again, take the break in between. Rosenshine's Principles, just to bring it back into context, I know science as a department chose to use that as a focus for their coaching last year, and they spread out their sessions throughout the year. So it's not something that's necessarily you just do one part of and you think, oh, that's it, I know it all now. It's got to be something that you keep going back to and looking at. The actual books themselves, look, are available now. You can either get them from John Catt Publishing or you can get them from Amazon at this moment in time. But they're great to go alongside the actual sessions. So by all means, try and get hold of a copy of those as well and do your own reading around the subject. The second session after Rosenshine's session, if you choose to go into this one, is produced by Kate Jones, and it's called Retrieval Practice in Action. So there's been a lot of information out there over the last couple of years, 3-4 years, on retrieval practice. We've done a lot on interleaving within school, but it may be that you really want to see the research behind retrieval practice. How can I start to get those bricks back into that brick wall? How can I check the understanding? How can I make sure that the pointing is done around the outside of the bricks to really ensure that the youngster has got that sound knowledge base and evidence from which they can draw from? Oliver Calvigoggi, I can't even say the name. You can see Oliver's name there on the slide anyway. Does a session on dual coding. Now, Ollie is great in terms of the work that he's done in terms of dual coding. His diagrams are absolutely amazing. Sam talked about dual coding earlier on, about this idea of having some sort of visual aid in order to enable the youngsters to see what's going on and to learn the information twice, to see it in text and to see it visually, so that starts to become embedded in their knowledge base, so that it's something that is well and truly learnt. He does a session on dual coding in action. That's worth having a look at. Ollie Lovell does a session on cognitive load theory, or in fact, Sweller's cognitive load theory in action, and understanding how cognitive load impacts on the learners. That's another one that's well worth watching. And then the final session is produced by 2 colleagues that work over in East Sussex at Heathfield Community School, and it's Mark and Zoe Enser, who do a session on generative learning in action. And again, it's Fiorella and Mayer's generative learning in action. So you've got 2 psychologists behind that, and then how that actually applies in the classroom today. Each of those sessions is packed with information about what we can use in the classroom. I hope that you enjoy the sessions that are there for you. I hope you get time away from the screens. As I've said, the deadline really for this training is the 8th of March. So it's up to you as to whether you choose to do it on Friday, whether you do it before Friday, whether you do it after Friday. That's entirely up to you. But what we do really need to focus on at this time is making sure that it's impact in the classroom. Have those discussions with your colleagues, go back, look at what we're doing. I'm really looking forward to the time that we can sit down and we can talk about this. We can talk as groups and we can share ideas. Have a great INSET day on Friday. I look forward to seeing you when you come into school.